Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Southern Outdoorsman Podcast, coming at you today from beautiful North Georgia. It feels great up here. I'm very excited to have this conversation today because today we're going to be talking about targeting mature bucks, specifically in the mountains and big wood settings, rut and post-rut. It's going to be interesting. And today we're in the home of Mr. Joey Youngblood. Joey, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Welcome to Young Harris, Georgia, and we're glad you're here. Always nice to meet new friends.
Yeah, man, you got an incredible place here. First of all, thank you for inviting us into your home, your awesome house. We were driving up your driveway, and I was telling Jacob, I'm like, this is what me and Tiff are trying to get to right here. You know, house out here, got a little bit of acreage, got awesome scenery, like you're out here, and it's just American dream, baby. Jacob, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm doing real good, especially being on the road, doing a lot more of these in-person interviews. Y'all are going to see a lot more of these over the next few weeks and months. But Joey, super excited to have you on the podcast. So I found you on one of our Facebook groups that one of our listeners, I think, started, the Appalachian Mountain Hunters, I think, Public Land Mountain Hunters group. And you made some posts about some deer you killed, and I was like, I'm reaching out to this guy, see if he'd do a podcast. And that's kind of why we're here. So one thing, Joey, I want to pitch over to you real quick is, what about the mountains do you like when it comes to hunting, specifically for the rut and also post-rut, which can be a super challenging time to hunt, especially in big wood settings?
Well, hunting in the mountains is interesting because I have 1 million acres that I can hunt. And in that 1 million acres, the hunting pressure is relatively light per acre, if you did it per acre. The age structure of the bucks because of that's really good. I've been blessed, and I've killed a lot of very mature bucks, 5 years old and plus, and I don't have to deal with people a whole lot. However, it does bring some challenges, but what I've learned over the years is it kind of makes you into a better hunter, is the deer density is really low. We might have areas in our mountains that have 2 or 3 deer per square mile. You have to really do your homework if you're going to be successful here. And so there's always that challenge. But the big challenge comes with big reward. So when you get lucky and you kill a big buck, man, you feel like you've really done something.
And that's a really good point. And that's something I think is a commonality between a lot of our other mountain hunters that are hunting low population, low herd density, per square mile, and the challenge that comes with it. But once you kind of figure it out, and you truly probably never figure it out completely, but you have a really good confidence of what you do, how rewarding it is to kill a buck in one of those areas. And that's, I think, a huge aspect. That's why I think me and Andrew are kind of drawn more into some mountain hunting. That's what we're about to go do in North Carolina. And also, just when it comes to the listenership, when it comes to listeners of the podcast, when we do mountain episodes, those are some of the most passionate listeners I've found, just because it's so challenging to kill mature bucks there, both with the archery equipment but also with firearms. And if you can find somebody like yourself who can do it and do it consistently, that's where I think there's a real good commonality that gets people very excited to hear conversations like what we're having today. So I want to start off with one aspect. When we're talking the rut and post-rut. Now, it's pretty early in the year. This episode's going to come out a little bit later. But it's pretty early in the season right now. Actually, season's not even quite open in Georgia. But when it comes to those time frames, what do you think is the most challenging aspect for someone who doesn't have a lot of confidence hunting the mountains when it comes to hunting the rut and also post-rut in the mountains?
For somebody who's not very familiar with the mountains can be very intimidating. There's a lot of land, and there's not very much deer signed. And no matter where you park on the road in the mountains, it's either straight up or straight down from where you park. And a lot of people get intimidated by it. That said, you can cover a lot of ground if you get on a ridge top. You can get a long ways away from the vehicle, cover a lot of ground. You can reach deer that probably never ever see people, which is, but that's awesome.
Well, I want to stop you there on that same subject. A couple weeks ago, it's probably already come out by the time people hear this, but we were talking before we got started that we interviewed Dr. Gino D'Angelo from University of Georgia a couple weeks ago, and they had done a study up in the North Georgia mountains, collaring does and outfitting hunters with GPS units, seeing where the hunters were going, seeing how the deer were avoiding them. And it was kind of a funny conversation because we asked you, we're like, what do you think the deer did, when the gun pressure came on, when guys were hitting the woods? And you said something along the lines of, it probably didn't do much to the deer because it's a huge area with few hunters, and that's what they saw in their research. So there's such big areas that people almost aren't having like a huge impact on the deer, how they're acting, just because it's such a big area and people aren't covering a lot of that area. And it was just interesting that you've kind of seen that right off the bat over these last couple of years.
Well, that is true. A lot of these in the Georgia mountains, you may have a 30,000 acre WMA that's got 150 hunters sign in or checked in, but when you ride the road, you might see a half a dozen vehicles maybe on any given day of the hunt. And the deer, a hunt is what's the word? Negligible to deer movement.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter. You're hunting deer that do not get bothered by people, and that's always an advantage for the hunter.
Mm-hmm.
What is your experience in history hunting the mountains? Like, being born and raised in this area of the state, what was y'all's upbringing like hunting in the mountains? Were y'all always public land people, public land hunters, or what was y'all's background?
Yeah, we always kept my dad would always keep a lease in Middle Georgia, but we always spent a lot of time hunting in public land in the mountains. The lease in Middle Georgia was always used for maybe early season. That they rut a lot earlier down there in the counties that we typically leased land in. Late October, early November. In the mountains, they typically rut late November, on up into mid-December, sometimes even Christmas week. So yes, we hunted Middle Georgia a lot, but we also, when it got prime time in the mountains, we was always in the mountains.
Okay. Now, as a young boy and probably getting into your teenage years, was there any like hard, fast lessons you learned from maybe hunting with your dad or maybe uncles or anything else like that from hunting in the mountains?
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, I was blessed to be born in a family that's got hundreds of years of hunting experience. Some of the lessons that I was taught growing up are just invaluable. You don't hear people even talk about them today. Everybody's so food plot driven, so lease in Middle Georgia driven, and they're more interested in what they plant in the food plot and try to attract a deer, and that's fine and that's fun. I mean, how can it not be fun? But there's also something to be said about going into the woods and reading sign and interpreting that sign and being accurate some of the time. You're not accurate all the time, but you go in with your gut instinct and then figuring out a deer and killing it, and it's just, man, there's nothing like that.
Yeah, and it seems like in the mountains, you have to really fall back on woodsmanship and sign reading, which we're going to get into a little bit more. But up here, it's so intimidating because it's big country and it's really steep, and you really have to work to go find deer. But also, you mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of deer sign.
That's right.
And so, what's the contrast between going and hunting in Middle Georgia, where I'm sure there's exponentially more deer than there are up here, versus up here, like the sign reading, the woodsmanship aspect? Like, how's it different?
Well, the difference would be the quantity. I may go in the mountains 2 or 3 miles and go to a particular gap, and I might find 1 or 2 big rubs or maybe 1 or 2 scrapes or a community scrape eventually. In Middle Georgia, there's one on every ridge. If you kill this buck, you can go to another part of the property and kill another buck, usually in the same weekend if you want to. There's just a lot more deer down there. So you got a lot less land with a lot more deer versus the mountains. You got a lot more a lot more land with many fewer deer. And in the mountains too, it's complex because used to the mountains had a pretty fair deer population, but in the past 25, 30 years, the bear population here has exploded exponentially. And I've had bow seasons up here where I was hunting the most beautiful white oak ridges, dropping acorns next to laurel thickets, had water close by. And I would go an entire bow season and see 1 or 2 deer, and I'd see 40 or 50. I'd have 40 or 50 bear sightings. So it doesn't happen like that all the time, but I've certainly had years like that in the past 5, 6, 7 years.
Yeah, judging from this big bear skin on the wall behind us, you've tried to do your part on the bears.
Right. A bear's funny. If you're deer hunting and you're on a great area and you're actually seeing some deer and things are coming together, you'll see a bear every time. But when you go bear hunting, sometimes it's a little harder to come by. But no, there's Georgia right now is pretty heavy on the bear population.
Now, I've always been curious about this because I've never hunted up here before, at least in this part of the state. When you get into the bears, or are you just out of the deer? Like, for instance, in Alabama, we'll have areas where hogs will move in, and it's like
and the deer are gone.
Yeah, a lot of hunts, you're either going to see deer or you're going to see hogs. Like, sometimes you'll see both, but a lot of times if you see pigs, you're not going to see any deer.
Right.
At least in our experience. Some people might be different. Is it the same way with bears up here, though?
This is what I've noticed, and if you're in an area that's really bear heavy, you'll see many fewer deer, period. If you're in an area where there's bears certainly, but they may only check out 1 or 2 a year, and the bear density isn't as high. You'll still see deer. But if you're in those areas where the bear population, and it doesn't take, you can go look at the stats. The refuges, the WMAs that traditionally have a very high bear harvest, almost always have a very low deer harvest. And in my opinion, that's because of the bears being very efficient predators on deer fawns.
Yeah, no doubt. Also, kind of guiding into this conversation, one of the things I want to get into right off the bat is, again, going back to the fact that these mountains are big. It's a lot of land. There's not a lot of deer. It's pretty intimidating. And really asking, I mean, we're going to be talking about the rut and stuff, but I'm also asking from personal curiosity, because in just a couple of days we're going to be hunting, not in Georgia, but in North Carolina in the mountains. How do you begin to take such a huge area and break it down in more bite-sized chunks to actually go and start finding deer? Like, where do you get started on 1 million acres?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. I challenge myself to find, I call them honey hole stands, A stands, where I can go every year and depend on killing a nice buck. I challenge myself to finding at least one every year. And that doesn't sound very hard, but it is. When you factor in family, work, you got to spend time scouting. You'll spend several trips and lots of miles walking. You'll burn a lot of boot leather to find just one of these stands. I challenge myself to find one a year. And what I do is, let's just say I want to pick a new WMA that I haven't hunted. Let's just say if I wanted to hunt Charlie Brown WMA. It's not a Charlie Brown, but just for example.
I was like, don't say the name of it.
Right, I almost did. I almost name dropped. It was on the tip of my tongue, man. But what I'll do is I'll start studying topo maps, old school topo maps. I'll buy the paper, the old paper version. You can still find them. I'll spread it on the table and I'll spend hours and hours studying, walking ridge lines, finding benches, finding gaps. In the mountains, you usually don't hunt many creek bottoms usually. That's usually more of a Piedmont thing because the creek bottoms in the mountains are generally poor habitat for deer. There's nothing down there for them except thickets. But no, I'll start studying topo maps. And what I like to find generally is, 8 or 10 places that are worth scouting, and then go scouting. I'll start eliminating areas. There's a lot of unproductive land. We got a lot of land, but a lot of it's not productive for deer. And what I look for is where you got 3 or 4 big ridges coming together, 3 or 4 leads. On the maps, they're named knobs. You don't hear a lot of people talk about knobs. I've had a lot of luck on knobs. You got 3 or 4 leads. Every one of these leads may have 1 or 2 horn trees and maybe a faintly used deer trail. But when the sum of all them come together on that knob, your odds will go way up. Go ahead.
Well, and to clarify on that, we're talking about knobs, that high point, we talked about almost like the center of a hub of a wheel.
Topo hub.
And then you have all the big ridges coming off that high spot, that knob. And that knob, the center point of that hub of the wheel, you could say, is the focal area where all those deer are going to probably cross through.
That's correct, yeah. Now, do you get on top of the knob? Usually not, but you get off one of them sides, where you can view 2 or 3 of them leads coming together. And topo map's important because it would be hard to identify that if you're just walking through there, unless you spend a really great amount of time in there. Nowadays we got cell phones. Boy, if I'd had a cell phone when I was young and in shape, hey, by the way, I'm 44 now, and I don't walk in the mountains as good as I once did, but second-class mail still gets delivered, right? So I get there. It's just on my time. But you can ping yourself on these phones, and you can see exactly where you're at. So if you look at a topo map, you think, yeah, I'm probably here. But now you can ping yourself, and you can confirm or deny that real quick, which is nice. And with cell service, it's usually good up top. Down in the holes, down in the creek, it's spotty. But on top of the mountain, there's usually now these days you got decent enough service. But one thing I look for is where several leads come together and form a knob, and then from there, you don't hunt the top of the knob. A deer's almost never going to go over it. But you can get around, walk around it, and then do semicircles going downhill until you find where the trails are and kind of figure them out. And you just got to use good judgment on where to set up. It sometimes isn't the best place you can see. Oftentimes it's not. Most of the time it's not. You want to find those trails that run just like you would in middle Georgia, or if you're hunting in the Piedmont where you're hunting the edge of, maybe where the big pines meet the little pines or the pines meet the hardwoods. You can still find, lines of laurel thicket. We call them laurel thickets, rhododendron thicket. Everybody calls them laurel, but a lot of times them deer, they'll run the edge of them laurel thickets, just like they run the edge of a pine thicket in South Georgia. So that's one thing I look for. Another big topo feature I look for is gaps. So a gap is you got a ridge line. None of them are flat, but let's just say, and then there's a depression in the mountain. Well, any game that's going to go through there, they're fighting that constant battle of energy versus food consumption. And, it's the path of least resistance. So pick out 8 or 10 gaps, go walk through them. Sooner or later, you're going to find one that the game's traveling. I've killed a lot of bucks in gaps, killed a lot of bucks on knobs. A lot of times under a gap, by the way, don't ever sit on top of the ridge and look down into the gap. I mean, I guess you can do that. You always hunt where the sign is. Don't hunt where you think they're going to cross. Hunt where the sign's telling you they're going to cross. That's part of woodsmanship, learning how to read sign. A lot of people sit in a gap and watch it. And yeah, if you sit there long enough, you'll have one cross it. But more times than not, they're funneling down the sides of the ridge, and they'll come under the gap. So a lot of times you have to, if the ridge is wide, you'll have to pick one side or the other to sit on. Generally, I pick the sunny side, the morning sunny side of the ridge. You'll generally have more action that way, but sometimes it's not that way. Sometimes you want to hunt, we call it the north side, which is the dark side of the ridge. That's where you get your moss. That's where you get a lot of unproductive trees. The sunny side, you get a lot of red oaks, and that's important during the rut. So that's probably clear as mud, but that's the line of thought I usually take.
There's a lot there, buddy.
So one terminology that you've mentioned, and I was wondering what you were talking about, gaps, because you mentioned gaps in the first 3 minutes of the episode or of this conversation, and what you're calling gaps is what some people would call saddles. Just that low depression on that ridge line that they're sometimes, a lot of people think they're crossing it, but a lot of times they're just kind of working the bottom edge of it, especially a buck, because any doe's going through, he can scent check right there.
That's right.
And also, at least in our experience, I'm curious about yours, you find a lot of scrapes in that area.
You do.
And a lot of rubs.
And you do, and this is why. So if you have a gap, by the way, all this sounds easier than it really is. If you have a gap, you're standing at the low point of that section of ridge. That from that gap, it can go up 1,000 feet in elevation on each side or more. So any deer that's on the side of that mountain, no matter what, has to come down by that gap. If you hunt the top of the mountain and you got another 1,000 feet, unless you just guess lucky, you're not going to see that deer. He's either going to come under you or over you, but that gap's going to funnel him down right by you. So, exactly to your point. Yeah, it funnels the deer. It's just a pinch point. I've heard them call pinch point deer funnels. That's the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's just something that's going to pinch the deer down to a very specific location.
That's exactly right. And whenever you have that and the deer are down in that specific location, you'll tend to get concentrated sign. That's where they'll put their community scrapes or post-rubs, things of that nature.
And also, by the way, you mentioned for these topo hubs,
explain what that is.
Or what'd you call it?
The knob with the lead ridges.
Yeah.
Right.
What's your term for that again? What would you call that? Where all the lead ridges come into one spot? Do you have?
On a map you'll see it called a knob or a bald. Same thing.
Okay.
Let's just use. We're not name dropping, but nobody hunts here. Brasstown Bald, the highest point in Georgia.
Okay.
Pull out a topo map, and on that specific lead, you can't hunt it because there's a tower there where people go view. It's like a state park. It's not a state park, but it's a public area. That bald has 2 or 3 leads that come to it, and if you drop down below where people are, you'll find a lot of deer and bear sign.
Okay.
So that would be one specific example you can go look at that, is not really name dropping somebody's honey hole.
So you say a lot of deer sign.
Right.
What does that look like up here in the mountains? Because I'm assuming it's a lot different from in the Piedmont, where you might if I'm comparing it to what I'm used to in Alabama, if I'm on a certain WMA in maybe central Alabama and I find a really good spot, I'm expecting to find dozens and dozens of rubs and possibly dozens and dozens of scrapes.
You'll never find that up here, hardly.
Yeah,
almost never.
So what's it look like up here?
1 or 2 fresh rubs, and then on top of that 1 or 2 rubs, you'll find 1 or 2 rubs from last year, and ideally 1 or 2 from 100 years ago. You start finding you get an area with multiple years of rubs, and you're looking at an area that has a potential mature buck. So that's what I look for. I never look for I've never found a quantity of sign really. It's almost, it is so rare to find an area where it's got 8 or 10 scrapes and 20 or 30 horn trees. If you go through 1 million acres, is there somewhere out there that has it? I'm sure, but it's rare. You I look for fresh sign. I look for big fresh sign, but I'm expecting to not find much of it. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, keep going.
All right. So your game trails on tops of these ridges. If people who are new to the mountains, they tend to stick to the tops of the ridges, and that's fine. I mean, if you do it enough, you'll kill something. But you'll find wide, flat trails on these ridge tops. Those are not deer. Those are bears. Bears walk them tops. If you want to find deer sign, you get off on the sides, and you'll find much, much more narrow trails that skirt the sides of these ridges, and the leaves are chopped up. That's deer and hogs. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. Well, on the trails alone, yeah, but hogs you'll generally find rooting. So if you find chopped up leaves, no rooting, and you start finding a few rubs, you're getting there, and you may already be there.
Man, that one little detail, like I don't want people to miss that. Chopped up leaves, like the leaves are actually like where their hooves are kind of cutting them up.
That's right. That's
as
exactly
opposed to
right.
like a bear's foot, their pads like mashing them down, right?
A bear trail looks like a human hiking trail. It's wide and it's flat. The leaves are matted down flat, and yeah, that's bears.
That's what you call woodsmanship, kids. That's what I'm talking about. That's awesome, man. Now, also, by the way, in these mountains, you're talking a lot about topo so far. Mm-hmm. Are you focusing exclusively on topo, or are you also looking for some kind of habitat, whether it be laurel or some other kind of thicket or whatever, or are you just going pretty much straight off of topo?
Okay, so topo first. Pick out 8 or 10 areas. Out of those 8 or 10 areas, one might be a good stand. When I call it a stand, a honey hole stand, one that's going to produce perennially. So what makes that up? Okay, well, if it's an early season stand, it's going to have white oaks in it, more than likely. Okay, you got to learn your trees. I mean, even if you're in middle Georgia, if you're hunting Florida, if you're hunting Timbuktu somewhere, learn what the deer are eating in your area, learn your trees. Later in the year, it's almost always red oaks. Earlier in the year, it's almost always white oaks. So I like an area that's got a lot of food for obvious reasons. I like areas that have a lot of cover. I like the wide open woods where you can see 200 yards, and in the mountains there's a lot of that. Might or might not be good. If it's got every other equation and then there's some laurel thickets around, that adds a lot of value to it. That might hold a group of does. That's very important when you're only got 2 or 3 deer a square mile. If you can find a group of does and it's the rut and you got red oak acorns and you got a laurel thicket and then the topo lines up with it, you've got a potentially good big buck stand.
Okay. And then, so when it comes to actually putting boots on the ground and hunting that spot,
right?
I'm curious on your thoughts on how often you hunt areas and how you decide when to hunt those areas as well.
Okay. I work for a living. Mm-hmm. I mean, I hate that. I wasn't born with a silver spoon. I got to earn it the old way, right? So I hunt when I can. However, if it's vacation week and I got an east wind, what's the old saying? When the wind's from the east, the fish bite the least. Mm-hmm. Have you heard that? Mm-hmm. I found that to be true in hunting. I found that to be true in turkey gobbling. I found that to be true in about everything. So if I got 3 or 4 days to hunt and I got an east wind, I'm going to go hunt an area that I thought about trying out. And if it happens to be great, then that's good. Sometimes some of my good stands I found that way. I greatly prefer a west wind or northwest wind. Why does it make a difference? I couldn't tell you. That's up to the deer gods. I don't know. But I'm saving my honey hole if I got time for a west wind or a northwest wind. A north wind's okay too. A south wind, whatever. You don't get a lot of that time of year here. So when do I hunt it when I can? But if I got a few days, I prefer to do it on a west wind day. Absolutely. That time of year, November, December, October, you got cold fronts coming in. That day that cold front's coming in can be really good, especially of the evening. However, the next day and the second day after the cold front moves in, you tend to have a west wind a lot of times, and I see a lot more game. I see a lot more rut activity, feeding activity. I see a lot more game activity, period, on the day and day number 2 after a cold front blows in.
Okay.
Now, I killed a big buck last year, and I'd hunted this deer off and on for 4 years. and it had been 2 years since I hunted him. And I don't know. I don't do cameras. I just read sign. And for all I know, it was a different deer, but I got a feeling it's the same deer. But I killed a really nice buck and had a wild rack. It was 8-pointer. One side kind of looked like an elk where the tines kind of come off the front of it. And I was super stoked. Well, I was a long ways in there, and I was by myself, so I had a choice. I could walk 3 miles back to the truck and get my backpack and come back, and it'd be midnight before I get out of here. I looked at a topo map, and I was 0.75 miles from the road, but it was straight down a mountain. So I thought, I'm going to live dangerous, and I'm going to drag it. And hopefully I won't get in the laurel thicket hell. Well, I did, and it was still midnight before I got home. But it was rare for a mountain hunt because I got the whole deer out of there, and that almost never happened. When you drag down, I mean, the deer basically drags you down. But I had to leave my climber. So the next day I got to hunt was the last day that little place was open, and I went back in there because I had to go get my stand, so I might as well get a hunt out of it, and I killed a 19-inch wide 6-pointer that was 5.5 years old. So, and it was the east wind, so there's an example of how it's not always a bad hunt if you have the east wind. I got lucky that day.
That kind of plays into another thing I wanted to ask about, which is how much time you give to a spot. Because another thing that's real hard for people, especially when they're trying to tackle a new area, like maybe if they're newer to mountain hunting or just whatever the case may be, is how do you actually gauge success? Because especially in these low deer density areas, I'm assuming you probably have a lot of hunts where you don't see anything at all.
You can. How do I gauge?
Like, do you have to see something every sit or every other sit?
I need to be seeing something. Even if you're in a low deer density area, you're still hunting over deer sign. So there's going to be some deer there. I've got to see something. If not, I'm on the move, especially when it's prime time. Now, if there's some factors involved, like some crappy weather, really gusty winds, something that's just not conducive to good deer hunting, I'll give it some more time if I believe in it. But no, if I'm hunting a day or two after a front and I think an area is good and I've never hunted there before and my buddies are texting me pictures of big bucks and I'm not seeing nothing, after about day 2, I'm out of there. I'm done. Now, that said, I talked earlier about honey hole stands. These are stands that have the potential or have been proven to be great buck producers over the years. I tend to be a lot more patient with them because I know it's just a matter of time before something good's going to happen. But no, if I'm new to an area and I hunt a great day or two and I'm not seeing nothing, then my theory was wrong in that area and I'm moving on.
Okay.
Very simple.
I'm curious. I know Jacob's probably got a question, but I'm also curious about when it comes to the honey hole stand. How quickly do you know whether or not you found something like that? Do you know, like through scouting and the sign that you're finding, like you're experienced enough now to know based on the sign and how the terrain sets up, you're like, this is a home run? Or does it take 2 or 3 years of trying it and testing it before you're like, oh man, I've really got something here?
It's different on every one. I've done it for so long, I feel like I can pick out a good place. When my gut tells me it's a good place, it's a good place because I've done it for so long. Sometimes I'm proven wrong. Sometimes I get lucky and I get it right. But no, usually if it's during the rut and I'm sampling a new area, I'm experimenting. I say I'm on a WMA I've never hunted before. I need to be knowing pretty quick. If rifles are popping and I'm not seeing nothing, then I'm moving on. So I hunt pretty aggressive. I hunt from a stand most of the time. Sometimes I'll slip along, but I hunt from a stand most of the time. But I'm pretty aggressive. If I'm not seeing what I want to see, I'm out of there. If I'm seeing stuff, I'll stay there from now to the end of the hunt. But if I'm, sometimes you're wrong. Sometimes your gut tells you wrong. And occasionally a spot you think's good is really good. You just have a couple bad days. Well, nothing's going to be perfect.
Yeah.
But no, I'm usually pretty aggressive with my stand setups, and I'm really, really that way in South Georgia. We go down to the hunting lease, they rut in October down there, so I hunt 2 different ruts, and if it's the week of Halloween, and I'm not seeing nothing, I'm out of there. I'm on the other side of the property somewhere, hunting somewhere different. Sometimes you can just adjust your stand 100 yards, and it makes all the difference. If you're looking at a section of ridge or a section of creek bottom and and you think it's good, and your gut keeps telling you, I know it's right, adjust it just a little bit. Go find something that's just a little bit fresher. It may just be one rub that was a couple of days fresher than what you found, and that makes all the difference, But no, I'm aggressive. If I'm not seeing what I want to see quick, I'm out of there.
And so you're doing a lot of in-season scouting then?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You better believe I do a lot of scouting. I do, in an ideal year, we all have families, we all have work and all this. In an ideal year, I probably scout 10 times more than I hunt, maybe even 20 times more.
Really?
Always looking for a place to hunt. This is my theory. For a lot of years, I didn't work for the power company. I worked for a corporation that owned me. Like, I got to hunt maybe 6 or 8 days a year, and that sucked. But, whatever. That was the predicament I was in. So I would scout in the wintertime. I'd scout in the summertime. And when it was time to hunt, I had to kill something. I had to be it was like a good business decision. I had to be very efficient. So that helped make me a better hunter, I think. But it's just the way it was then.
And how has that changed now with like your new job and everything?
Well,
like you got more time?
Well, I've been there 10 years. Yeah, I do have some more time. I was in management for that old company, and I would work 6 days a week a lot of times, and that was salary, so you didn't get paid for it. And, we all have a job at some point. We just do what we got to do, and that was, my years of my life doing that. But no, I got a better job now. It's better for the family and better for hunting and better for everything.
Yeah, definitely. To kind of summarize, this is kind of how my brain works, and I want you to tell me whether or not I'm on track here. But when it comes to use a term from an old episode on the podcast, making the big woods small, making the big giant mountains a little bit smaller, you're basically drawing an X through areas that don't have the terrain features that you want and don't have the kind of woods that you're looking for. Maybe they don't have oaks. Maybe they don't have any kind of cover.
It could be dominated by poplars and hickories. There's not much there for a deer unless the grapes hit. We call them fall grapes, unless they hit hard. You got a lot of coves in the mountains that are probably 200 or 300 acres, and you won't find a deer track in them. And then you'll find 3-acre patch of red oaks, and it's just obliterated. So yeah, you have to eliminate a lot of land, or that's my strategy. Now, late season, a lot of people, they're long since checked out. They're not into it mentally anymore. Post-rut, I've had a lot of luck post-rut by hunting red oak. Sometimes, we have an oak tree up here, oak tree species called a chestnut oak. They're the last resort for deer. They're big acorns. Apparently, they don't taste very good. Apparently, I tasted one time that made me pucker up. Right, I was just like, oh god, I can see why they don't eat these things. But no, a lot of times at your last resort, I'm talking about December. If you hadn't tagged out by then, sometimes you can find a chestnut oak that probably didn't taste as bad as the rest of them, and you'll find some feeding sign under them. In the poplar coves that are generally unproductive, a lot of times they'll have fall grapes, which are little bitty grapes that grow just like grapes you buy at the store, but they're much, much smaller. Deer and turkeys will really, really dial in on them late in the season a lot of times.
Interesting. Okay, I was going to ask about fall grapes because I didn't know if you were talking about muscadines or something else.
It's different. I don't know a whole lot about them, and it's not very often that I'm at a point where I still have a tag left that late in the season when they're really effective. But no, if you can find fall grapes, you'll find deer and bear and hog and turkey. You'll find everything in the mountains.
Okay.
There are certain years when the acorns are bust and fall grapes are where it's at.
Now, just to kick it back real quick to the cover aspect. You've mentioned mountain laurel or rhododendron a couple times. Is there any other kind of cover out there, or
generally? Okay, well, there is. If you go through enough mountains, you'll find old clear cuts from 70s or 80s where the woods are real thick. But no, generally, more times than not, like 95% of the time, it's rhododendron and laurel thickets. If you're in the mountains, if you're in the Piedmont, it's almost always habitat's so much different down there. You got a lot of where they're growing pine trees. So you got different different stands with different ages of pines. So, it's kind of obvious where they bed down there.
Yeah.
And how they travel. But no, up here, laurel thickets and rhododendrons generally where it's at on the deer cover.
We have some mountain laurel in Alabama, and we've hunted around it a good bit. Mm-hmm. And, is there one thing that makes one mountain laurel thicket better than another one? Because, man, look, there'll be some where we hunt that are like 6 feet tall, and you can just walk right underneath them. I mean, you barely have to duck your head, and it's pretty open. And then there's other ones that
You can't walk through.
I'd cut beagles loose in it. I
Right.
mean, not that there's any rabbits in it, but it looks like there should be rabbits in it, you know. So do you see that here? Like, does that make one better than another? Or
Some of the laurel thickets, due to clear cutting, are a lot older, and you can walk through them better. Some of them, aren't, and I don't really care. All I care about is if there's deer sign there. I just tend to see the deer sign close to the laurel thickets, almost always. If there's deer in that particular area of the mountains, they're going to be tied into the laurels most of the time.
Okay. And then also another thing with the laurel specifically is kind of like you mentioned earlier, we'll find trails running the edge of those laurel thickets.
Right.
And that we'll usually end up picking up a couple scrapes right there too. Like there'll be a scrape, maybe where a laurel thicket's coming around a ridge, and then that it bends around and comes to the point of the ridge and goes around to the other side. There'll be a scrape like right there on that point.
Right.
Do you see anything similar? Do you pay a lot of attention to scrapes in particular?
I do. I don't ever hunt an area just because I'm seeing a scrape. I have not seen bucks clean out a scrape very many times. I mean, I've seen it happen, but I don't see them walking the scrape line very per se. They just happen. That just tells me there's a buck in the area. It doesn't really dictate where I hunt. I want to hunt where them trails kind of cross and kind of get close to each other. I want to hunt the intersections. A lot of times there'll be a scrape there, and sometimes they're just on the trails coming to them, right? Mm-hmm. The trails they might travel not as much because the trail isn't quite as wore out. I like to hunt. I like to find a bunch of them and find kind of the area they're kind of crossing. That would be a potential hunting hole stand or a potential A stand.
Okay. Yeah, we do every other Thursday we do a Zoom room call with our Patreon members, which are just people who support us, and we did one last night, and we were talking about scrapes. We'll look at maps for the Patreon members and like talk about their properties and everything, and we got to talking about scrapes last night specifically, and the subject of mock scrapes came up. And for me, with scrapes, it always comes back to the deer aren't going and finding a scrape. The scrape is there because the deer are there first.
That's my observation. I agree.
And it sounds like that's what you're talking about. And you've mentioned rubs and scrapes and other things. What's your number one piece of deer sign in the mountains that just really fires you up? Where when you see it, you're like, oh yeah, this is it.
Big rub. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. It's specifically on deer sign. Yeah, if I see some big rubs that are in the same general area, yeah, oh yeah. Because I know you can't tell. I know they say you can't tell how big the deer is based on a tree he's rubbed, and to a large extent, I agree. But when if I find 3 or 4 of these ankle size rubs, bicep size rubs, you almost always have a good deer there.
Do you ever read deeper into the rub? Like this is like totally a deer nerd question, but like, yeah. Do you look at it like the scars, like how deep he's digging in, like if he's got real good purling on his bases or anything, or how tall it is?
Nobody knows what purling is.
Hey, it's a new term. We're introducing it.
Okay, now if I could derail just for a second, I have a cousin that wanted me to show him how to hunt, and first off, I warned him, any advice I give you will probably jinx you and you'll never see anything. But he was brand new to the deer hunting scene, right? So I was showing him some rubs, and I thought I'd mess with him. And I licked my finger, and I licked the rub, and then licked my finger again. And I said, right there's an 8-pointer. It's probably pretty good. And I forgot about it. Well, this cousin, he ended up liking deer hunting. He ended up, he killed a few deer, and next thing you know, he's deer hunting with us. And I brought a friend along on a hunt about 5 years later, and I had long since forgotten about that. And he told my friend's name's Sonny. He told my friend Sonny that he said, Joey can taste a rub and tell you how many points it's got. And he was as serious as he could be. And Sonny, me and him cut up, and he knew that I'd spun a yarn. And he said, you told him you can taste a rub? And I said, yeah. So anyway, that's a side story. But to answer your question, I don't get into that. Sometimes I've noticed rubs are dug in, like maybe a brow tine or something. Maybe I don't get into that. I have never killed a buck that I've had on trail camera. So if he comes out and he's a 20-inch wide 6-pointer, I'm happy. If he comes out and he's a 125-inch 10-pointer, which, North Georgia, that's hard to come by, then I'm happy. I don't get into the scores or all that. I'm after a mature buck, and if God gave him 6 points, great, and if he gave him 10 points, great.
That's awesome. And we talked about that before we got started, how you don't really use trail cameras anymore. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, kind of your thought process behind that?
Sure. My thought process is when they first come out 20 years ago or whatever, I bought a couple of them, and by the way, $150 in 2003, whenever I was a senior in college, was a lot of money. And I bought one of them. I put it out, and the very first time I put it out, I got eaten by a bear. So, that was a bad start. And then that year, I learned that if I put out cameras and it messed with my bias, I guess is the word. If I had a buck on camera, I was biased to that specific spot, even if he was just coming through at 3:30 a.m. and never any other time. And conversely, if I put it in an area and I wasn't getting pictures, I wouldn't hunt it. So, I didn't have a very good year that year. And in my mind, it's because I put too much emphasis on a camera. So ever since then, the rare occasion I put out a camera, it's just for a point of interest only. Or if we do a food plot somewhere, and it's just so you can kind of get a feel on what's in the area, but I never ever let it impact where I'm hunting. No, it's just for a point of interest and conversation only. I noticed there's a lot of people who base their strategy on what a camera's showing, and if it works for you, great, but it doesn't for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had a hunt last year in Alabama where I hunted near one of my trail cameras that it been getting some activity, but not a ton. And I went in there and hunted next to it. And that morning I had, I think, 7 deer come by, including a doe being chased by 2 different bucks. And not one of them, they all got within like 10 yards of that camera. And I didn't get a single one of those deer on camera. But I saw them physically, and I'm like,
right. How
often does this happen? And I'm like checking this camera, and there's nothing on it. And I'm like, God, that spot sucks.
Right.
Yep,
exactly my point. And, yep, I agree. It's point of interest only. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, too, I still have, right now the only cameras Georgia season opens next weekend, and the only cameras I have is on my own property. I couldn't care less about putting a camera out there on a white oak stand in the mountains and it get eaten by a bear. That would make me mad. So, and that's what would happen, by the way. A bear will find it and a bear chew it up, and you'll be excited going there with your card reader I'm not very techno savvy, but you walk all the way in there to check your camera and it's laying in pieces, and you're like, man, are you kidding? He got me again. Then, by the way, talking about emotion and hunting, then I'm going from a deer hunter to a bear hunter. So he just signed his last deed right there.
Oh man, that's awesome. I really want to go back to talking to a little bit more terrain specific things.
Okay.
Specifically on, I'm just going to call it a topo hub because that's what I'm used to. But these knobs that you've been talking about, you mentioned that they don't really go over the tops of those very much. So if you were to kind of paint a picture of how the deer, like, tell me if I've got this right. If it's like the spokes of a wheel. Mm-hmm. And the spokes come to the center, they're like walking up one spoke, getting to the center, and then going around onto another spoke.
Yeah, I guess. First of all, they're all different, but generally, so you got the top of the knob. They might walk up one of these ridge spines or leads or whatever you want to call it, and then they're flaring off to the side before they go to the top of it. At some point, some way, going from one lead to another one. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Almost never. I mean, okay, you go through enough of them, you'll find one where, there's probably something up there they're feeding on. But no, from a topo standpoint, you got these spines. They're going up one, and then before they get to the top, they're detouring off somehow.
Cutting over to a different one.
Right.
Side hilling around to it.
You got it.
Okay, so then when you're in there scouting that, you kind of touched on this earlier, but do you ever go to the top of that and look for anything? Like, do you look for buck sign, scrape, anything up there?
Oh, yeah, I cover all I can while I'm in there. I sure do. And I've had a knob or two where they used the top real good, but generally it's off on the side. Where specifically would I climb? It just depends. And sometimes you try one for a day or two and it's not working. You got to switch to a different one. But I try to find where them 2 or 3 of them trails kind of come together. Always. I love it. Now we're talking rut hunting. I'm not talking bow season. Rut hunting, I love trail intersections, especially trails that have even just a little bit of buck sign, but it's good buck sign. Like a bigger, nothing that's pinky sized, but more bicep sized. If I can find some of that, I know I'm close. It's just whether I can close the deal.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've never really hunted those before, but we have a couple buddies of ours who focus on those in Alabama, but it just seems like it's on a much larger scale up here in the mountains. And another thing that interests me about spots like that is where the deer are actually bedding. And this kind of goes back to something we mentioned in the very beginning, talking about Dr. D'Angelo's study of the hunters and how it didn't really impact deer movement because there wasn't enough hunting pressure to impact it. But I'm curious on your thoughts on getting to these spots undetected. Like, where do you think the deer are hanging out, where they might be bedded, and how you're accessing and basically getting in there clean? Or is it just so low deer density that you're just kind of, making sure you're not being super loud or anything like that, but it's not really something that you have to put a ton of thought into?
Okay, a lower deer density helps with that. So I don't put a lot of thought into it, because if you're hunting public land in the mountains, there's one way that's possible to get to it, and then the rest of them, just no, right? So if you park, you may have a 2-mile walk this way, just for example, or you can go on another road and have a 6-mile walk another way. And I mean, who would do that? So I don't put a lot of thought into it. I try to get in there early before daylight, and if I blow one out, I blow one out. It's just part of hunting. Now, if you're in an area that's super high deer density, you got a really high deer density, let's just say maybe you're hunting food plots somewhere, then I just wouldn't hunt there in the morning. I know I'm going to blow them out. Old granny does are going to get up there on the side of the hill and blow at me for 2 or 3 hours. That's who wants to do that. So I try to use, in those cases, which I don't hunt food plots much, almost never, except if I'm just here at home. I try not to hunt them in the mornings. If I'm hunting a place in the woods, if I spook one, it's not the end of the world. A lot of times they'll settle down after 20 or 30 minutes and they'll come right back, because you're hunting deer that don't get pressured. Now, if I'm hunting somewhere that's a really high pressured area, well, I mean, if you spook him, you spook him. That's just life. But I don't spend a whole lot of strategy worrying about spooking a deer walking in. I'm either going to do it or I'm not. I don't use scent killer and all this stuff. A lot of people waste a lot of money on that. I don't do it. Don't matter. I almost never. I don't even wear camouflage most of the time. I wear blue jeans and a comfortable jacket.
Nice.
So, and I do that in South Georgia too, by the way. I'll be the only guy down there wearing regular clothes, and everybody else will be head to toe and something, matching camo.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, you look good.
I'm color coordinated at least.
Right.
Do you typically walk the tops of ridges into spots, like based off access, or because you said, again, the side hills is where you're finding a lot more of the deer?
Yeah, I try to walk the path of least resistance, and just the most efficient way to get there. Let me give you an example. One stand, okay, like that one I was telling you about earlier where I drug a buck out and it was 0.75 down the hill. Well, that's just 0.75, right? But the elevation is like 1,200 foot in that 0.75 from where I killed the deer to the road. Well, that's a pretty steep climb. When it's 3:30 in the morning and I park my truck, do I want to climb straight up 1,200 foot? I mean, I guess I would if that was my way in there. But I had another way in, an old, what we call skid row, that walks the ridgetop. It's 3 miles, but it's very, very gently sloped. And I go in that way. Yeah, almost always. That's just the way I prefer to do it. Now you ask a bona fide big buck killer, and they may not bother them. I guarantee you they're 20 years younger than me. But no, I generally go the path that's the easiest to get to. Sure do.
So I've got a bunch of other questions since Andrew talked for the last 45 minutes. When you were talking topography, because I'm very interested in getting more of your thoughts on topography, you've mentioned gaps or saddles,
sure.
And that's something you like. And then you're talking about these knobs of these lead ridges or spines coming up to it,
Right.
which Andrew's calling, again, what we talked about. It's like a topo hub. This is a hub activity. Everything's come to a central point and kind of going around it. Is there any other topographical features that you really like to key on that's maybe more subtle, that's like one of those things that maybe you can find on a topo map, but something that if you can find it, it could pay off, but it's something that doesn't necessarily grab your attention as some of these bigger features?
We call them benches. Sometimes depends on where I'm at and how the sign is. So a bench is I know there's a better word for it, but you got a big mountain that's going up, 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 and then you got a big flat area, and that flat area may run parallel to the top of the ridge, and it may be 1,000 foot below the top. It may be 200 foot below the top. A lot of times game will travel on them benches, and I've had a lot of luck hunting them in certain cases. You got to have everything else though. You got to have food. You got to have cover close by. A lot of times they'll travel them benches just like they would they'll use them just like they would a gap. It's just the path of least resistance. For a deer, it makes more sense to walk it and not expend so much energy and go up and down all the time.
And again, like any terrain feature, not all of them are created equal. Cover's a big factor, food source, sign, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
For a bench to set up where you'd feel confident in it, what kind of cover would you want to see there? Again, the sign, you've already mentioned the sign, but are you finding crossing trails there, and how does cover play a factor for benches?
Okay, so for a bench, if it's got cover, great. If it doesn't, great. It doesn't matter as much. Is there sign there? Are they traveling it? I'm not going to hunt it if I think they might travel it. I want to hunt it because they're showing me they're traveling it. A lot of times them benches have good rub lines on them. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Sometimes they'll use a bench to get from one set of laurel to another occasionally. Like they may walk a half a mile on this bench to get from a huge thicket way over here to a huge thicket way over here. I've seen that. It's not something I see all the time or really look for all the time, but it's happened. Let's see here. Another topo feature. You don't see a lot of this except in extreme North Georgia. I'm talking about like the northern, getting close to North Carolina. Rock cliffs. A deer can't, I guess they can, but if you got a bona fide, genuine rock cliff, and I'm not talking one that's 10 feet, I'm talking a real rock cliff, one that if you fall off of it, it'll kill you. Walk above it and walk below it. And if there's deer in the area, a lot of times that'll funnel them. They'll funnel right under that rock cliff a lot of times. So that's something, if you happen to be in an area and you see that, it's worth checking out. If you're seeing some rubs and some fresh tracks, it may be worth it for you if you can't find nothing else. That would be a topo feature that I've had luck with on a couple of occasions.
Okay.
You see a lot of rock cliffs when you get up within just a couple of miles of North Carolina on the national forest.
We have some in Alabama. I found them in Arkansas. Rock cliffs, rock lines. A lot of guys in Virginia call them rock lines. We call them bluffs. But like what you're saying, and then also, we've got guys in Alabama talk about finding bluff gaps where there's actually a gap going up through, not a saddle, but like a ditch that cuts up through that rock wall.
Yeah. That
the deer can actually go up and down and hunt those during the rut as well. So that's interesting. And finding some of that up here in different areas. So again, topography is a huge aspect for you. The other thing that I'm real interested on, specifically when you're talking about sign and trail intersections, like when we're talking about the rut, trail intersections associated also with some larger fresh rubs specifically in that area is a big key for you. How do you typically see deer traveling? Not only, I want to know like time periods, like do you see a lot of morning movements, or do you like morning hunting a lot during the rut? Do you like midday hunting? Do you like late, in the evening hunting specifically during the rut in these mountain areas? And also, how do you see the bucks traveling compared to the does?
Okay. So we're talking rut hunting that time of the year. And I'm hunting up in the mountains, and I'm hunting ridges, and I'm hunting ridge traveling trails. And oftentimes that's a long walk in there. Oftentimes I'm packing in a climber just because that's what I like to do. If my personal schedule will allow, I prefer to hunt from daylight till dark. I'll go to the dollar store and I'll buy like these little bumblebee boxes with chicken salad and some crackers. They're like $2. I put a couple of them in, and they'll give you more energy than you think. And I'll take me some bottled waters. But no, right at daylight and right at dark, there's always peak deer movement, and after that, it doesn't matter. It can happen at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, or it can happen at 8:45 in the morning. But yeah, I tend to see a spike in movement, obviously right at the end of daylight and right at the start of daylight. But after that, it's any man's guess.
Okay. And then how do you see buck travel compared to doe travel in the mountains? Is it similar or is it vastly different?
Depends on the acorns. If it's a year where acorns hit high, you'll see does up high. And I say high, I'm talking like 3,000 foot, 4,000 foot. If it's a year that acorns didn't hit so well, I tend to see a lot more bucks up high and almost no does. If you ever see a doe up high, you better get ready because something's going to be behind her. But no, it depends on the year and where I'm at. Yeah, if acorns hit high that year, you'll see groups of does. But if they didn't, if it's one of those years where they didn't hit high, yeah, the does will be in lower elevation. They'll be down like where we're all at right now in my house. They'll be down here in the settlement eating out of cow pastures and stuff.
Now, also specifically, I guess talking about the deer movement aspect, talking about like does being down low, bucks being up high.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever keep tabs on where you see does in the mountains because it's such low deer density? Do you ever take notes on where you're seeing does and kind of key in on that for future years?
I've had years where I don't even know if I've seen a doe in the mountains. I see 20 bucks for every doe on average, I'd say, hunting up high. My brother and I have a saying. We say it's lonely at the top, but the eating's good. We're there for one reason, and the odds are we're not going to get anything, but if we do, it's usually a mature buck, and those ridge running trails, he's going from point A to point B, all these hollers, we call them hollers. Mm-hmm. He's winding, early in the day, that the air's heating up, he's winding. All he's doing is walking. We call him zombie mode. His head's rocking back and forth as he's walking. I'm sure y'all have seen it. And if you ever see a doe, you better get ready because something's coming.
Okay, let me ask you a couple other things specifically with the rut and talk about that. Because you see so many more bucks than you see does, are you a guy, do you implement calling at all?
No. I say no. Sometimes I'll have a rattle bag and I can get bored sometimes and I might tinkle on it. I don't ever go crazy with it. And I think in my life I've called in probably 2 or 3, but it's not been anything that I really rely on. I do take a grunt call. I've seen that work a lot of times. I don't go crazy with it. Just every 20 minutes or so, just and put it up and don't think nothing else about it. But a lot of times after I've done that, I'll have a buck come by and you think, well, did that really have anything to do with that? And sometimes I think it does, but it might be just for keeping the monotony down.
Now talk to me a little bit about how does wind play a factor? You mentioned earlier on you like a west wind, northwest wind, something of that.
That's my preference.
That's your preference.
Yeah.
Do you care about wind when you actually set up in the stand, as in whether you're facing downwind, upwind, anything like that? Like, because everybody we've talked to that hunts the mountains, the wind's so variable. Like it's coming out of a certain direction, but it's going to swirl.
And it's always blowing. Excuse me. And even if it is coming from the west, it's going to hit them cove and it's going to swirl, right? I mean, it's just what it's going to do. So if I'm in a spot, and I can go lower in elevation, I'll do that in the evenings. You might want to look up to where you're hunting that you expect a deer to come from because your thermals, going down. Mm-hmm. In the morning, I want to be above them if it works out. I'm not. So here's the deal with it. By the time that deer smells me, I already know whether I'm going to shoot him or not, and I'm going to shoot him. If he smells me while he's in a laurel thicket before he steps out, then he won that day. I raised a white flag and salute him. I rely more on wind down in middle Georgia where I'm hunting a lot closer in than I would up here.
So by saying that, you'll go hunt some spots that maybe the wind's not 100% in your favor, but you're going to go sit those spots just based off the opportunities, and hopefully you're going to have the opportunity to see that deer and shoot that deer before he hopefully gets a smell of you.
That's right, yeah. I'm not going to let it deter me whether I'm going to hunt or not. It's just if I had my preference, I would prefer a west wind or northwest wind. Now, let me correct myself. A lot of times in the evening, if you're in a certain area, it's obvious they're going to be coming from this laurel thicket. Obvious. I mean, you're in there. There's some red oaks that are just getting churned. They're going to be coming out of this thicket. All the trails are coming from there. Yeah, I'm going to try to position where I'm not blowing straight into that thicket if I can help it.
But on these long rut travel corridors, it doesn't matter.
Couldn't care less.
Okay, that's a common. I'm glad to bring that up because that's a commonality with a decent amount of other mountain hunters. There's some that are a little more cautious about it, but a lot of them
big woods in general, I feel like guys are kind of like this, kind of like right spot, wrong wind type thing.
Well, it's like you just never know which trails of all the different trail intersections, especially like around a gap or a saddle, or one of those ridgetop hubs where you have all these spokes of these other ridge points coming up to, or these long ridges coming up to this knob. You don't know exactly which one they're going to come up. You're watching somebody. He might come in from behind you or off your side or whichever way.
That's right. And a lot of hunters will set up on any one of those because they found some rubs. Okay, well, there's about a 1 in 10 chance or 1 in 6 chance he's going to come up yours. But if I'm up here, there's those odds because he's going to walk right by this guy on this other lead. You know what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. It puts the odds in your favor. It's all odds game. You got more trails, you'll see more game.
Now, another thing that I've been really interested in talking to you about, and you've mentioned the Piedmont region a good bit, which Piedmont region, I really didn't understand what that was until about 2 weeks ago. Right. Pretty much it's the hill country in Georgia. From you mentioned earlier before we started recording, from the coastal plains all the way up to the foothills of the mountains, it's the foothills. That's kind of what we hunt back home. It's not called the Piedmont region, but we hunt a lot of hill country. How does your mountain strategy for hunting the rut apply to the Piedmont region, the hill country? Is there any crossover between you going down there from up here and then also taking skill sets of how you kill deer down there up here? Is there any similarities and differences between them?
Most of it being the skills I've learned in the mountains I employ down there. So I think where our club is now, the elevation's 400 foot on average. So a ridge may only be – so if my camper's sitting at 400 foot, the highest ridge on the property is probably only 415 or 420. But what I've learned is, we talked about I hunted on the Barrier Islands a couple of years ago, and those ridges are only 3 or 4 feet above sea level, but they're still ridges, and the deer still travel them in the same consistency they do in the mountains. It's just the elevation's not as high. The trees are different because it's mostly pine trees, but no, they'll still travel. The big bucks still travel the big ridge. They sure do, at least on the property I've been hunting for the past 15 years.
Is there any skill set from hunting like the Piedmont region, like the hill country of Georgia? Is there any skill set from down there that would apply to the mountains, or is it just vastly different? It's easier going from the mountains to the Piedmont.
No, I employ the same line of thought on both. Hunting edges. Like up here, we hunt the edge of laurel. Down there, I hunt the edge of pine thickets. Down there, early season, still white oaks like up here. Later in the season, we actually have a couple stands of red oaks, and which is kind of rare for down there, I think. But man, the deer hammer them Thanksgiving week. If you're ever down there late November, man, the deer are hammering red oaks, and so are the hogs, But, they switch, We have an oak tree down there called a willow oak. They hit them real early. I think it's a kind of white, a certain type of white oak, really small acorns. But the deer really hit them in late October, white oaks and willow oaks. That's big down there.
So, looking back at the mountains then, still staying on the rut topic, because I do want it in a few minutes probably transfer over to a little more of that late season post-rut hunting, because to me that's a very challenging time of the year. But also when you're talking about hunting the mountains, we've talked about access, we talked about the deer travel patterns, we talked about weather and all those kind of factors. What do you think is the biggest mistake most guys make that hunt the mountains that maybe don't have the woodsmanship or the experience that maybe someone like you have and some of your family members?
I wouldn't call it a mistake, but they're intimidated by the mountains. They're not willing to get out and walk. They don't scout much. And they're just their heart's not determined enough to really lay with it long enough to kill something. It's just how bad do you want it? I think that would be, in my observation. A lot of guys come up here now and they're not really, if they see a buck, great, but they're really wanting a bear because bears are different for most deer hunters. Most deer hunters don't hunt in places where there are bears, so a lot of our visiting hunters, they're trying for a bear.
I got to throw this out here because someone's probably wondering what getting it. I know we were talking about previously about maybe trying to do a deer and bear episode, and we just, unfortunately, I don't think we had the time for it. But what is like one of your biggest tips if someone was wanting to come to North Georgia and shoot one of these troubled bears and keep them from eating your cameras? Okay. What would you give them a piece of advice as in to pay attention to?
Number one, if you want to kill a bear, do it in the first 2 weeks. Do it in the first 2 weeks of bow season. By far, that's the highest probability of killing a bear in Georgia. September, the month of September. And find white oaks that are dropping. Find white oaks that are dropping that also have bear sign, which is bear scat, claw marks, bear feeding sign, which is obvious, and you'll kill a bear. But however, sometimes it's 30 yards from, or well, 300 feet from the truck. Sometimes it's 3 miles from the truck. You never know. But you find a specific tree the bear's eating under today. Find scat from today and yesterday, and you'll kill the bear. If it's from last week, he's gone. You have to be real. Time is of the essence. You have to get him while he's hitting that tree, because they'll tend to feed under 1 or 2 trees.
And they'll be there for like a day or two, and then they're
gone. Yep.
Man.
There's some other strategies, but yeah, that would be the one I would say go for.
Okay.
I'm gonna try it here in the next year or two.
Okay.
I'm going for it.
Well,
Yeah, we were talking about it. I've like I told you earlier before we started, Joe, I've killed a bear in Arkansas on some public. Andrew hasn't killed a bear yet, so he's been like
we'll have to
die hard.
I really want to kill a bear.
You need to kill a bear.
I really want to kill a bear.
Okay.
I'd love to come up here and help you out with your
well,
issue.
come on, we'll go do it. In fact, what are you doing next weekend? Maybe we'll go do it next weekend.
Dude, listen.
We can swing back by.
We can swing back by.
Yeah, we already got all of our stuff.
Right.
We should shoot all your arrows in North Carolina.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
But is there anything else that we're missing on the rut specific topic of hunting the mountains? Like anything else that's like just notable things that you do, lessons learned, some experiences, stories?
So this is what I tell people. Number 1, love hunting. Do it how you love it, right? If you're not having fun, what's the point? So I love it. I love it when I'm so cold I can't even move because that 50-mile-an-hour wind's blasting me, and I'm sitting there, my teeth chattering. But most people don't. A lot of people don't. So do it to the level that you love it. That would be advice I would give anybody. If you're happy shooting a spike, then you're happy shooting a spike, and I'm happy for you. You know, that's the best eating buck in the woods, by the way, is a young buck. But that would be the one thing we haven't talked about is do it to the level that there's a lot of pressure on the internet. A lot of people kind of can be negative, but man, if you're happy shooting a young buck, shoot it and hunt it. And who cares what anybody thinks? It's legal, so enjoy it. Just do it to the level that you love it. You got to have fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Hunt your own hunt, man.
That's it.
Hunt your own hunt.
Ooh.
I got a question before we move on. This actually might tie in with late season, but mentioning hunt, like finding acorns and hunting under oaks, whether you're hunting red oaks, white oaks, or whatever, you've mentioned finding some feed sign. What does feed sign up here in the mountains look like? Like, what does it look like on the ground where you can tell that deer have been eating underneath that tree?
Well, again, remember we're hunting areas that typically don't have a high deer density. So if I find a red oak tree and there's red oak acorns, holes in the leaves. Like imagine getting a deer foot off when you harvest and putting pressure on the hoof. Those are deer tracks. It's hard to explain it, but
Punch holes.
Punch holes, absolutely. You're finding, if you're seeing a lot of that and you're under a red oak tree that had a lot of acorns, and you're finding some deer feeding sign. If you happen to be in an area that has a high deer density, it's a lot easier because it looks like somebody took a tiller under it, right? Well, you don't hardly find that in the mountains very often.
Now, let me ask you something.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically with that feed sign, do you pay attention to the association of those punch holes underneath a red oak with only a few acorns on the ground versus maybe you find a couple punch holes and there's a bunch of acorns laying on the ground, as in it's not as high of a feature because they're not eating all of them on the ground? Do you ever notice anything like that? Because some of our guys we've interviewed at the hunt, like the Piedmont region, they specifically talk about that.
It's easier to pick up on that in areas with a high deer density. I would say, to answer that, for the mountains, right now when bow season's starting, that would apply more. Because you may go through some white oaks that are dropping, and I know we're talking about the rut, but it may be raining acorns, but there's no feed sign, and all of a sudden you find a tree that has some feed sign. Those acorns may be a little sweeter or whatever. I don't know. I've never really noticed that when it's rut time as much.
Okay.
Maybe I'm sure it happens, but I don't pick up on it.
So before we transition into post-rut, late season hunting, because I'm very interested in learning some strategies there. One question, you were telling us earlier, and you got quite a few bucks in here that are mounted. Some the viewers can see, some can't. Maybe we can shoot some B-roll afterwards to cut into the podcast. But you've killed quite a few on these quota hunts. these are bonus buck hunts. Okay. Yeah. What is your strategy for bonus buck hunts when you only have a very limited time to hunt a specific spot, and it may be like the 1 or 2 chances in a season you get to hunt it?
Sure.
Like
Screw the wind. Forget about it. Just hunt. You've already done your scouting. The way the stars align, you can't help it. Be out in the woods and hunt it. Last year I killed a real big buck with an east wind, and I wouldn't have been there, but I left my stand there, so I had to go get my stand. And I thought, well, if I got to get up and walk my fat butt all the way in there, I'm going to at least get a hunt out of it. And then lo and behold, it happened. And it was a dead east wind. I mean, it was like worst case scenario, but it happened that day. But no, I wouldn't read too much into that. I just hunt. You got these bonus hunts. You got 2, 3, or 4 days to hunt. We got work. We got family. We planned all year for this. If the stars don't line up, then that's not my doing, but I'm going to be out there, period.
Okay. I like that.
Yeah.
That's very common. Guys like some of our buddies from Alabama that kill a lot of big deer, Michael Perry, Jamie McKay, these guys that hunt kind of a lower population area of Alabama, some really big deer, and we don't have quota hunts, but we have these short gun hunts like I mentioned to you earlier before we start recording, 3-day little hunts. They don't care about the wind. They're going to their specific spots.
That's it.
They're hunting travel corridors. Deer come from a bunch of different directions, and they're just like, hey, we're gonna play it how we can.
What I've learned in deer hunting and turkey hunting and bear hunting and fishing and life in general is the minute you think you know it and you're going to guess it, they'll humble you every time. Every single time. Okay, like back here behind the house, you can bait with corn in Georgia. Well, it's behind my house and I want to do it, so I'm feeding them corn. I could take you back there today and say, you're going to see some deer, shoot one, and you won't see a deer. I mean, that's just hunting, man. Every time you think you got it figured, and that's why we do it. Every time you think you got something going on, it'll humble you in a hurry. And the only answer in those cases is you just got to keep going. And sooner or later, the odds will even out.
You got to be a little stubborn.
You do got to be stubborn. You got to get mad at it sometimes.
Lucky for me, I'm very stubborn.
Well, I can tell.
Well, and to transition off being stubborn, hunting late season, post-rut, you got to be real stubborn to do that.
You got to really want it a lot of times to do that. But you know what I found? Like, I've been blessed. I've killed some good deer, a lot of mature deer. My oldest deer, looking at jawbones, I'm talking the ones I've killed that are 5 and 6 and up. Most of them have come after the peak of the rut. And I think, and you may have somebody who really knows deer tell you different, but my theory is the does are bred. Okay, if you go through enough of them, you might find one, but the bucks kind of go into anxiety mode and they get on their feet and they're traveling, looking for that last girlfriend or whatever. And in the mountains, this would be the first 2 weeks of December. And I'm hunting we're doing the same strategy. I'm not changing anything on my strategy. But it just seems like those 5-year-old plus bucks show up after the peak of the rut. And I think it's because they're anxious. They're trying to find that last shot, and they're on their feet trying to find it.
And specifically with that mindset, knowing that, hey, you have a higher likelihood of an even older age class mature buck showing up, covering more ground, how does that, and you said your strategy should change, but how does that mindset change for you, dealing with the conditions, dealing with the colder temps and all that?
Oh, my goodness, yeah. I know my deer sightings are going to be way lower than they was 2 weeks ago. I know I'm probably not going to see nothing. That's how my mind's got to be. I got to be confident where I'm at, but I also know the odds are I might not see anything at all, but I'm going to try anyway. It's like when, if you play football, I played football, you're down by 2 scores and it's getting late in the game. You're going to throw a Hail Mary. You know the guy, it's not going to work out, but it might. And that's all you can do. Okay, so post-rut also in the evenings, even on a WMA. Remember, these WMAs, they don't get a lot of pressure. They may show 150 people checked in, but did they really? Probably not. Or did they show up? Probably not. It is not a bad strategy to find a food plot. I don't like hunting food plots. I mean, I'm nothing against it. It just don't excite me. But a December strategy would be to find a food plot that the deer are feeding in. And it's not hard to tell if deer are hitting a food plot, especially that time of year. And sit in it, and you might have somebody come out there. following a group of does or something. A December strategy on bad acorn years, post-rut, I'd be in a food plot in the evening. I sure would.
Now, let me ask you strategy with that, because we hunt, get a bunch of public land that you can hunt late season opportunities on, especially talking rifle hunting too. And there's food plots out there. Do you pay attention to the isolation of a food plot, like how far from axis or what's around the food plot that potentially would have a higher odds of potentially a buck coming into it, checking does?
I would pay attention more to the pressure, the human pressure in the area. And mountain WMA, it tends not to be much. I would pay attention to what was planted in it. If it's a perennial plot, there may not be as much action. If it's a food plot they planted with wheat and stuff, like attracting, wheat, rye, and oats or whatever, and then I'm going to, it don't take long to scout it. Walk out there and look. If you got deer droppings and you can see where they've been nipping it, you're going to have some action. The odds are long anyway, but you could have, it could make your season if you've had if you struggled so far. We've had that. Can't do it every year. I don't do it every year, but I've had that.
And then also looking back, off the food plot. So the food plot's a really good option, especially late season. Less guys hunting. People don't want to deal with conditions post-rut. But again, you could have the opportunity of a buck coming out there checking does, especially if you had some does, drop it off into a plot.
Oh yeah.
Now, outside that, back in the timber, you said your strategy doesn't really change, but what else are you looking for any like fresh sign? Like, are you pre-scouting or doing any scouting when you start getting the postseason, or not postseason, post-rut, late season opportunities where you're trying to find some new fresh rubs or anything else like that potentially? Or is it just kind of relying back on those large terrain features that's going to funnel deer around?
So if I have a couple of days and I have a tag left and it's post-rut, I'm generally hunting what I know is honey holes. And then if I had a new place in mind, sometimes I'll try something new. There's no real, when I get to that point on those years that I still have a buck tag, I'll try about anything. I might have a place, okay, so I hit my honey hole, nothing's happening there. But when I squirrel hunted last year, I found this place on the other side of the refuge that's kind of been in the back of my mind. That's a good time to check that out. Hey, sometimes you find a new honey hole doing that. I talked earlier about I'm kind of aggressive with my stand hunting. If something's not hitting, it's getting late in season. It's time to throw a trick play out there.
Do you feel like you would bounce around more so late season than you do during the rut, or is it still like kind of sticking it out?
No, I bounce around during late season because my strategy hasn't worked. So no, it's time to try something new.
Okay,
absolutely.
Okay.
Late season though, almost always red oaks, maybe chestnut oak. It's happened, but it don't happen as much. But no, it's mostly red oaks that time of year.
Funny, you brought up the whole we call them mountain oaks, mountain chestnuts,
right.
The ones you're talking about. And we had those in Alabama. Where we hunted Georgia last year, like first week of bow season, there's a bunch of those that were dropping. I mean, you needed a hard hat underneath those trees.
Right.
Yeah. The white oaks weren't quite dropping yet, and we actually found pretty good feed sign on some of those mountain chestnut
right.
oaks, which is way different from the swamp chestnut. So all you flatlanders out there,
right.
guys that hunt river bottoms, not the same species. They look a lot. The acorn looks very similar, but the tree looks very different though, like the bark and everything.
I've heard those swamp chestnuts are where it's at down there.
Yeah. For sure. Guys in South Georgia, South Alabama, river bottoms, love those trees. But the funny thing is, like when I first started hunting public in Alabama, more hill country, like more aggressive than some of the stuff you find in the Piedmont. But there's a bunch of mountain chestnut oaks out there. And I remember the first year I started hunting it, oh man, this is the honey hole.
Right.
There's acorns on the ground. This whole ridge is covered. I'm going to kill me a deer. You'd sit there 2 or 3 days, and this is high deer density, and you might not see anything, which is
right.
a problem. You should be seeing a bunch of deer down there. And I didn't realize that until many years later that they just don't feed on those acorns. And that's the biggest mistake I see, and because it comes up on social media a lot, when guys aren't used to hunting that kind of area, they find those acorns and like, man, I found the honey hole, can't wait to hunt. And they take a photo and they post it on all these groups. And I'm like, dude, I'll message
You're
them.
about to get lambasted.
I'm like, just heads up, dude. It's not what you think it is. Because a lot of them, like I thought it was a swamp chestnut when I first found them. I'm like, because, hunted other places and you'd find those, especially in the black belt of Alabama. And it's just not the same species, and they're just not nearly as palatable, it seems, for a whitetail compared to a swamp chestnut, a white oak, some of the different red oak species, and alike.
Yeah. I've been around here my whole life hunting, and my friends are hunters, and their friends are hunters and family. I can count on one hand the number of deer I've gutted that had chestnut oak acorns in their paunch. And the few times that's happened, it was years when the red and white oaks was a bust. And I think they was just in starvation mode. I mean, will they eat them? Sure, but they don't prefer them.
Yeah. It's like one of those things like you mentioned, bust years, or just when there's not opportunity for other mass, that's the only thing they got to rely back onto.
That's right. And I want to go back to that. On those bust years, our state does a pretty good job on these mountain WMAs with food plots. On those bust years, and it's those December mountain hunts, hit them food plots in the evening. Even if it gets dark at 6 then, even if you don't get out of the truck until 5:15, jump up there and sit on a food plot for 30 minutes, and you'll be surprised sometimes what'll come out there. And on those years too, on those bust years, you'll find a lot of shed antlers in them food plots, February and March. You sure will. They will really key in on them.
Are you much of a shed hunter?
No, I don't specifically go for them, but I find them a lot during turkey season.
Okay. Does that ever play a factor for you? If like you find a pretty big shed, a nice shed, like
never.
Hey, okay, so you're like, I'm not going to hunt this.
No, it's just a lucky find. And,
okay.
And when my dad was alive, he made knives, and I'd always give him shed antlers to make knife handles out of. He made knives for a lot of people that still have them to this day in North Georgia and Western North Carolina. He's pretty well known for
it. I got a question about late season. You mentioned that these bucks might still be looking for those last few does, especially the bigger bucks. That's something we've actually talked about with several people in the past, is that it seems like that late rut, post-rut time frame is when the big bucks end up getting killed a lot of years.
I agree with you, yes.
And maybe due to that. And also maybe some of the pressure kind of comes off and they get a little more bold towards the end of that rut. I don't know. I'm just kind of spitballing with that. But the reason I bring that up is, do you focus on the exact same terrain features that you do in the rut, or do things change? Like, are you still looking for these knobs? Are you still hunting the gaps, saddles, or do you switch things up?
The difference between peak rut and post rut?
Yes.
No, my strategy is exactly the same until the evening, and then I might go sit on a food plot.
Okay, I got you. So you're not like hopping on a bench and running a bench trying to find feed sign. You're still hunting those same exact spots post rut.
Yep, I sure am.
Gotcha.
Especially if I got somewhere. The only difference would be is my strategy to that point hasn't paid off, and I've got a new area in mind that I haven't ever hunted or haven't hunted much and been meaning to give it a shot. Post-rut's definitely a time to try something new if what you've been doing hasn't worked. But no, the thought process on where I set up is exactly the same as a peak rut.
Gotcha. Okay. What you got, Jacob? Post-rut.
By the way, we're fixing to start bow season. If the strategy during peak rut, if I go hunt them places I'm hunting during peak rut next week when the season opens, I'm not going to see anything. I just ain't going to, because number one, it's red oaks. They're not hitting red oaks now. They're going to hit white oaks. And somewhere white oaks are hitting. I just thought I'd throw that out there. But no, from peak rut to post rut strategy, my line of thinking is exactly the same.
Selfishly, I'm going to ask you a question here, because by the time this drops, this will be completely irrelevant except for next year. But, it's early September. We're about to head a little bit north of here, hunt North Carolina. We've never hunted, big mountains like this, like true Appalachian Mountain early season bow hunting. What advice do you have for us?
White oaks. I wouldn't worry about getting far from the road. In fact, I'd go against it.
Preach, Joey.
Because it's hot. You don't want to have to be packing meat in 80-degree weather 4 or 5 hours, right? Human pressure is a non-factor. There's not that many people to bow hunt in the public land in the mountains. It's just a half a mile from here. You're just not going to see much hunting pressure at all. So if you find a good area that's close to the road, I wouldn't let that bother me at all. I'd be all over it.
Oh, this has just changed the conversation. Okay. So, Joey, let me ask you this. Some of the public we're going to go to, that it's like Andrew mentioned, pretty good elevation. There's definitely some bigger mountains here than where we're going to be at, but still big mountains where we're going. There's houses and communities at the foothills of some of these mountains at the base of the public.
Excellent.
Okay. So my thought, you tell me if this is a decent game plan. Andrew wants to go shoot a doe on the top of a mountain.
Listen, okay, hold on.
He's been talking about. No, I'm throwing you under the bus.
All right, whatever.
So, anyways, he wants to. There's a couple spots he's really interested on, real high up. Which I told him we're going to go to this area, hunting, and with a thought process, maybe next year come back during the rut, maybe during the gun season, muzzler season, and try to capitalize on it. There's a lot of these features you're talking about that was set up fantastic for the rut.
Yeah.
My thought process, and I told Andrew this on our episode. By the time this episode came out, it was weeks or months ago. But episode we recorded last week, that my thought process is kind of staying up above some of those houses, kind of, because I know some of those deer are going down to these houses feeding on landscaping. They probably have feeders down there, whatever. People just feeding their neighborhood deer.
Sure.
What is your thought process in that for an early season strategy, trying to catch a buck or something, drop it down?
Perfect. Without knowing exactly where you're going or scouting it or laying eyes on it, I mean, people feed deer now, hunters and non-hunters alike. It's illegal. It's popular. And if you got a settlement, we call it, up here in the mountains, we call it the settlement. If deer's in the neighborhood or the settlement, just get above them. Find you some white oaks. When they get done chowing on corn or whatever they're getting fed, then they're going to come up there and pick up an acorn or two, and then they're going to get a rage in the cage.
Now, does that hold true during the rut as well? Will you still kind of key in on that a little bit?
It can very well be true. You just have to play it by ear and see what kind of sign you're finding. But yeah, no, if you got a lot of does, and at some point you're going to have somebody in there checking them out.
Okay, selfishly, we're talking about this now. It's going to be irrelevant.
I'll tell you this too. Western North Carolina is full of excellent hunters, and if that strategy would work, somebody around there's probably already know about it, and somebody around there's probably already checking it out. So bow season, your best time right now for that to work for a buck.
Okay. So let me ask you as well, talking September openers, Georgia opens next week.
Right.
North Carolina opens tomorrow, Saturday. We're recording this on the 6th. And with it opening that early, there's probably some bucks that are already shedding velvet, some that haven't. Are you paying attention to any other sign outside of tracks and trails potentially early during bow season, or is it mostly just finding feed trees and finding punch holes associated with it and tracks?
For me, during bow season, it's feed trees. And one thing that's fun, where y'all going to be, and then also here, because it's the same thing. I mean, it's just stone's throw. If you find a white oak tree that's getting hammered, you don't know when those leaves are crunching if it's going to be a bear, which I think bears are still legal. Are they not?
It is, but the season won't open while we're there. It doesn't open until October, unfortunately.
Ooh, okay, changed it then, didn't it?
I know, it's a bummer.
That's what I wanted.
Total bummer. Almost made me hunt Georgia this year instead.
I had a choice. I was going to be a resident up here in North Carolina because I looked at a piece of property and I thought, you know what, a man just can't. I just can't live like that with a 3-month deer or a 3-week deer season. I just can't do it. But anyway, they're gonna have to fix that, ain't they? But well, you might see a bear then. You can take some pictures of it, I guess. But no, that first 2 weeks of September, if you find a good white oak feed tree, you're going to have something.
Yeah,
you'll have some action.
Okay, and do you pay any attention to how close some decent cover is to that white oak? Like, if it's like in a wide open stand, you can see for 200 yards.
This time of year, the woods are full. If you're on a ridge top, you're going to get some, I don't know what the real name is, but we call it mountain grass. I mean, that serves its purpose. It can be waist high or higher. That's a thicket. The woods are full. I don't pay that much attention to it usually.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Unless the sign dictates otherwise.
Okay. Because one thing we noticed up there looking at, so Onyx Maps, they have a mass-producing oak layer, and it breaks it by white oak species and red oak species.
Yeah.
And when you have that layer on, one thing we've noticed is a lot of red oaks higher in elevation, mid to high elevation. A lot of the white oaks are lower elevation, on the kind of around the base of the mountains, kind of going up maybe a third of the mountain. Again, very close to some of these houses. So that was my thought, is kind of side hill and get at, not the base of the mountain, but maybe a third of the way up, and start checking those oaks kind of, within maybe 300-400 yards of these houses, and seeing if you can find.
Just check your deer track. Make sure you got deer tracks and deer trails.
Yeah.
And you'll be fine.
Okay.
Now, a lot of times white oaks, we was talking earlier about knobs and, hunting up top. A lot of times on these very tip tops, there'll be a lot of white oaks, and they'll be stunted. They're above what's called the frost line. and they'll be this big around, but they'll only be like 25, 30 feet tall. A lot of times those hit real good. So if you happen to be in an area where you're close to 4,000 foot or up, it's worth checking out anyway.
Okay.
Especially, I wouldn't want to walk too far this time of year because of the heat and meat and all that, but it's worth checking out.
Okay. Got anything else, Andrew?
I think that's all I got. I'm going to talk to you about some stuff off camera.
Yeah.
I don't want to say too much.
Whoa, easy now.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, Joey, we greatly appreciate you letting us come to your house and do this episode with you. Listeners, if y'all enjoyed this episode, go leave us a 5-star written review, or go leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and also a written review on Apple Podcasts. All the listeners out there and the viewers, again, if you enjoyed this episode, also share this episode. Greatly appreciate you guys sharing the episode with a bunch of your friends and family. Tremendously helps us grow the show and allows us to be able to do more podcasts like this, in-person podcasts, travel around and get some of these awesome guests on. So we appreciate everybody watching the podcast. Appreciate you listening to the podcast, and we'll catch you back here in the next episode from the Southern Outdoorsmen podcast. And remember, guys, y'all stay Southern.